Thank you, everyone who's here in attendance in person as well as online. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to just explain that I am with a nonprofit called Project Liberty Institute, and we've been doing some really interesting and important work in collaboration with a number of people you'll meet on this panel, plus others, a total of 18 participants in what we've called the Fair Data Economy Task Force, looking at really the, I think, vital question of, is there an alternative to the current digital economy in terms of an alternative to the concentrated market power of big tech that actually empowers individual citizens to have a greater stake, a greater voice, and a greater choice in the digital economy. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up on stage our panel of speakers. We're going to be divided between several speakers in person here in Waterloo at CIGI, and then several speakers online as well. So, if I may, Miapetra, Kumpula-Natri, a member of Parliament Finland, and someone very well versed in questions of digital economy, having served both in Finland and in Brussels as a policymaker on these issues. Also want to bring up, of course, Paul Samson, president of CIGI, will be joining us and giving us some keynote remarks. And also one of our favorite partners, Christian Kastrop from GSI, Global Solutions Initiative. And then online we have Alex, or Sandy Pentland, professor at MIT, as well as a fellow at Stanford in the Digital Economy Lab there, will be online. Cristina Caffarra of CEPR, the Competition Research Policy Network based in Europe, is joining us online. And Paul Fehlinger, my colleague from Project Liberty Institute, will be online as well. So, very excited to be here. Christian, would you like to say just a couple words, and then we'll turn it over to Paul, I believe.
Also a warm welcome from me. So, Global Solutions Initiative, say a think tank which is working with the respective G7, G20 presidencies, and I'm very honored to be here today. And I think we are talking about really a great project, about a report presented by our partner, Project Liberty, and I think we are very close in our opinions, and so I'm really very grateful for this also big support. We will also bring forward to our Global Solutions Summit in Berlin in May, where also we have the honor to have CIGI there. So I think this project about fair data economy and the task force, I think this is really, really a very, very important one. I think also in the digital arena, we are at a very critical point in using digital technologies. And I think we are an organization who is a bit combating for the global common good. So what is the issue where we can really agree on also on a global level? And I do not need to tell you that this is a very topical subject right now. And I think it's so important as also the digital environment will encompass all other areas of our lives, of our international cooperation. And this is why we really should talk about that. And I think the ideas here produced by the Project Liberty team, I think are really, really very, very forward-looking, and there could really be a game changer on a lot of issues from business to politics, and also to support the civil society of the globe. I stop here, Jeb, back to you.
So we'll have remarks from our panelists, and then we will definitely have time reserved for questions and comments, discussion. So it's my understanding that you can submit questions online as well as in person. So we look forward to that. But without further ado, I really, again, want to say thank you, Paul and CIGI, for hosting this conversation. Thank you, Paul, for being part of our Fair Data Economy Task Force and really helping us obviously bring this conversation into the T7 and G7 environment. So please, over to you, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Jeb, our moderator, welcome to the Great White North. It is cold up here. It's tough. Our colleagues from Finland here. So I'm feeling that it's pretty common. It's been a real honor to be on this task force. There's a number of thought leaders from around the world on it, and it's been quite an adventure to be part of it, and then try to distill the findings into 17 recommendations. Maybe we could have trimmed it a little bit more than that, but there was so much to say. Let's start with the title of the project and the work itself, which is composed of 3 words: fair data economy. And I think if you unpack each one of those, it starts you with the right frame of reference as to what this is about and why it's important. So if we take the first word of fair, it's a very general word, but the point of the use of that word is to say the current system is not as inclusive or equitable as it should be. To design the exact right balance is very difficult, but it should be fair, more fair than it is, right? And so I think that's the meaning of the first word in the project. The second one, data, it's kind of a boring word in a way, right? It sounds like it's just something that's out there that you don't even notice. It's just like oxygen or something, right? But in fact, what we've seen is that data has emerged as an asset in and of itself, over the last decade or so in particular, because it is being digitized, because it's being commoditized, because it's being tokenized, all of these forces, and it's being gathered all the time, right? The amount of data that we all emit as we walk around, even those that probably don't have that big a data footprint, you still have a pretty big data footprint, right? So it's at the personal level, it's at the state level, it's at the company level, it's the lifeblood of what's going on. It is truly an asset. And as we're seeing AI take off, generative AI in particular, data is the source for AI. Without the data, the generative AI goes nowhere, right? And that's why there's so much debate about copyright, about the quality of data. So the centrality of data, can't emphasize it enough, right? So that's the second word in the title of the task force. The third one is economy. And of course, it's all about the economy, right? Stupid, or whatever that expression was south of the border a couple of decades ago. And it's true that without the economy working well, you can't do much else. You can't support the social programs that you want. You can't have international activities to the level that you would want them, including international development assistance. So the economy has got to be working, and this is a missed opportunity so far along those first 2 lines. It's not as inclusive as it should be, and it's not that optimized. One of the core issues was already alluded to by both the moderator, Jeb, and Christian, who spoke about the role of a handful of companies, right, that have utterly dominated and do dominate this space. It's too important a space to have dominated by so few. And so that's kind of the rationale behind the selection, I think, of the topic and its importance. As I said, we divided it into 17 recommendations and 4 categories, and I know others are going to speak about these categories and how they were designed, so I won't touch on that. What I wanted to talk about now is the G7 and how these recommendations relate to the G7, because that's the spirit of this gathering as a whole. So I wanted to relate this initiative a little bit in that context. And what occurs to me in looking at the G7 is the G7 is in transition, as everything else is, right? There's so many moving pieces around the G7, geopolitical, technology, etc., that the G7 is trying to carve out its own future vision. I would suggest that the collective interests around data are one of them, right? And the interests don't align completely between the G7 countries, because there's always a national interest angle to it as well. But it does feel like there are some questions that have common interest. And so here's my list that data ownership and stewardship is a common interest of the G7 countries, right? And that there should be interoperable frameworks, obviously, from an efficiency perspective, but also compatible frameworks that recognize the value of privacy and the value of other key elements. And they're fairly aligned, but they're not that well aligned within the G7. And I think it would be prudent for the G7 to align those, both from a security perspective, from an innovation perspective, from a leadership perspective. The G7 has an ability to convene and to drive working groups and things, and I think that something in this space could be something that the G7 could do a good job at, right? Convening some kind of work on the role of data, talking about how you get this balance right. I think that relates to the ethical use of data as well, would be part of that. The next thing that could be something that the G7 could look at, and these are part of the recommendations. I'm basically trying to pull out pieces of the 17 recommendations we made that colleagues are going to speak about in a moment and relate it to the G7. The next area would be about digital infrastructure. And what the G7 could potentially consider there. I think the G7, could see this as a revolution that's happening in this space with again, data as that core asset that would talk about how are these infrastructures compatible? How are they interoperable in terms of identity systems, trust frameworks? And a lot of this work is going on, but it could go further, right? Is there also some kind of public-private infrastructure hub or initiative that the G7 could look at? It's not really happened yet, right? Where there's something that's recognizing the value of the public goods and the private advantages and innovation here. And so those are the kinds of things that I thought were relevant to the 17 recommendations that we came up with that I think I would highlight for the G7. I will leave my comments there for round one and pass on to colleagues who are going to further unpack the 17 recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I think that, again, we're really excited to bring this conversation into the T7, G7 environment and share with people in the room and online some of both the actions that we see as important, but also some of the questions that we still have. So to speak a little bit more about, as we've called it, a blueprint for action, and to give you a sense for some of the things that we think are important based on the discussions and research that we've done, I want to turn it over to Miapetra, Kumpula-Natri, to help share a bit more about that blueprint for action that we see forward.
Thank you. I'm just telling my perspective for the group was that we need to do something and not to wait for the best possible framework to occur. And I can say that because I was one to blame in the EU regulation that we did already. And it's not perfect and it's not the final, but then also to wait for whole country, the whole world to unite, to do something, it's too slow. So I also call others for action. On the G7 level, on UN, they have the digital compact, on local level to start making purchasing and helping the startups to evolve with their fair data principles, and local governments, national states. So it's not to do and wait issue for me, but it is something that we need to frame together. Of course, you can then find the details that, okay, interoperability is something that you can have a lock-in if you move without thinking the cross-border data transfers and standards and so. So this is my attitude for the thing. So then I'm very happy that this project brought us together, governance, business, studies, academia, think tanks, and so. So thank you very much for having this opportunity. So the global view we had, and it's so much happening, and as you hear the puzzle words here yesterday, today around the data in general. Maybe the question is that, is it optimal now? Is the world what we want to see now happening when the data is concentrated in the hands of few? And then I think we see that it's not optimal for the growth and economies, not on the local economies, it's not optimal for the regional economies, and it's not optimal for the global economies either. So not optimal for the business and wealth and budgets to grow for the national states either. So that's why it is a challenge that we can work together and try to find some framework how to change. What is this multi-billion-dollar challenge that we are losing the opportunity if we do not do anything and look and wait? So the pillars we tried to structure our thinking was that the four, and first of them was like entrepreneurship and the business models, because we see that nowadays the business models are favoring the very massive data usage in the hands of few. So what can one do to try to break that? One is help actively dedicated entrepreneurship who have different principles and try to create a bigger ecosystems than the single small ones and accelerate the usage of that. We know there are many, but they are often tiny and spread. So sometimes dedicated funds for data economy, fair data economy usage and promoting markets on the best practices. Innovation hubs, as mentioned here, could speed also the information and attract more participants to participate. So this is also already a holistic approach needed. So then Pillar 2 we had in our report was like a next generation digital infrastructure. And this is something I see much going on in many places. If I would not be here in Canada, I would be the same weather conditions in Finland to inauguration of the one AI factory. European Union is now supporting AI factories to come. So this is very concrete digital infrastructure kind of infrastructure alliances that can be done. It's connecting the high performance computing, the supercomputing, that is also European Union money in. It's called Lumi, which is snow in Finnish. So around that they create AI factory so that a lot of researchers, companies can join and use that computing power that they would not be able to create as a small enterprise, having access to this computing power. And in Finland, we also link that with the quantum counting possibilities and with the good infrastructure for the digital in general. So this is just one example that you can also fulfill something that you are having the gap. You don't have these massive calculation powers and others. So this is also the infrastructure that scale the stack, and it can be done together, public, private, and civic collaboration. I just pick up one example on that one. But of course, we are eagerly waiting for EID to come in Europe to include all the 320 million people to use e-identity that can be then spread of a lot of use cases and coordinate. So this is something we wait for. And also data agency is then in the hands of people themselves much more. So then we will come back to this in the panel, I'm very sure. So then the third pillar was the policy innovators, how they can boost the change. So yes, also the governments and governance. So what intensive and enabling environment for the data practices can be created. So regulation is not always stopping the innovation, but can create demand also. And how to prioritize even the intensive taxes for those actors who are respecting the data rights can create the intensives for companies to be created. And then the fourth one was something that I'm not specialist on, how to mobilize private market investments as well. It can be collaboration with the public sector funds and so, but then how to make it visible. And I think we also need inform decision makers, private and then in the governance, to have this financing mechanism that and calculations and really show that how this data opportunities are lost if we are not taking more active data policies. The opportunities, the cost of losing the opportunities is quite interesting also looking, because when EU started to regulate data last term, like AI Act, the Platform Act and Data Act, Data Governance Act, the fact behind was that only 20% of the data is in active use. 80% of the data was somewhere in the silos, inside the companies, inside the governments, because they were lacking the trust. So this was the innovation. And then what is the lost opportunities, cost of lost opportunities if we don't open up and trust more and make data to flow?
Thank you, Miapetra. A number of points there that are worth considering, and hopefully as we go through our presentations and then in the discussion, we can return to some of those. I do want to emphasize that the Fair Data Economy Task Force really was multi-sector, multidisciplinary. We did have people representing investor communities, the private sector, as well as the public sector. So I think that point I really want to hammer home, that this has to be more than just a policy discussion, and it has to be about the tech. It has to be about solutions that involve both the public and private sector. Now, without further ado, but with some warning to my online colleagues, you guys are huge. You are like 3 times the size of anyone on the stage. So you don't have to speak loudly, but you will have a major impact on this discussion. So first I want to turn among our online colleagues to Cristina, Caffarra. You've seen it from so many perspectives, and I think you're going to really help us imagine a world beyond regulation. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Paul, for inviting me to this and for steering the Project Liberty whole initiative. Thank you, CIGI, for having me here. My background is in antitrust. I'm an antitrust economist. And so in that capacity, I have been involved in all of the big antitrust cases of the last 2 decades, focusing particularly on digital. The collective learning, I think, from that experience, and I think we are now far advanced enough to be able to draw conclusion, is that unfortunately the antitrust project and the regulation project are failing. They are not delivering real change on the ground. And I say this as someone who has worked a lifetime in this space. There are a host of reasons which have to do with the way in which intervention is too late. Intervention tends to be targeted. Intervention doesn't address business models. In Europe, we have switched from antitrust intervention on specific cases to an attempt to do ex-ante regulation. So instead of telling companies this is wrong, you should ex-ante tell them this isn't to be done. But the reality even of that project is that it is not delivering real change on the ground. To be very clear, we cannot regulate ourselves, particularly in Europe, out of a laggard position in digital. We cannot regulate ourselves in any shape or form into a different paradigm. This is something which is important and urgent because as a collection, we have put a lot of investment into the regulation and antitrust pot. We have convinced ourselves that that kind of intervention can change the landscape, that if we tame the big players in some way, that will create a level playing field in which others can thrive. The answer is no, paradigms are changing, others are not thriving. We are in effect, particularly in Europe, a digital colony. And if we want to tackle that, we absolutely need to abandon the idea that antitrust and regulation can deliver and need to move to a different way of thinking. I'm not optimistic, I have to say, about the extent to which policymakers can help this progress, because there is, of course, a lot of activity, particularly now in Europe after the geopolitical transformation of the last few weeks and months, around the idea that we need to somehow transition ourselves to a more autonomous, sovereign infrastructure in which data, of course, is a major component. The concern I have that this kind of change, if it is managed from the institutions is going to be another failure, because there is a big disconnect that has developed between the policy, the institutions, and the way in which business sees itself and sees the future. In Europe at the moment, which is the area I know best, there is a huge gap between what the European Commission is doing to pursue these kind of goals and what business thinks should be done to pursue these kind of goals. And this is not a small concern. Miapetra mentioned the AI factories. The AI factories are a big flagship for the Commission. They're investing millions and millions in these AI factories around Europe. There is no single entrepreneur around Europe that says, yay, we have AI factories. This is the answer. This is what I've been waiting for. It is a way of using the existing assets in a way that could be imagined to offer some cheap compute to someone who might need it. Where is the business model following from that? What is the real thinking? No one in business in Europe is saying, wow, the AI factories is the answer we are looking for. So the reality of the policy arena and the institutions is that they are at loggerheads with what business needs. And the most important learning is that we need to somehow bridge that gap. Business has urgent objectives. We need, of course, in Europe to create a different infrastructure. We are a total colony. We have in every dimension of the stack, from chips to compute, to connectivity, to data centers, to cables under the sea, a dependency that is extreme. It is not going to be lessened by some showering of money from Brussels into tiny little projects that are incoherent and not structured. There needs to be a voice of business that is heard. And this is currently the biggest sense of urgency that we need to bring to this discussion. If industry isn't involved and heard in this, regulators and institutions are going to continue to scatter money in random ways, in ways that will not help. Data too. We have regulation in Europe on data, GDPR. It's a dirty word now. No one wants to talk about it because it has failed. So exactly what are we doing? If we're not listening to business on the ground and not scoping our interventions around that, we are just kind of going around in circles. Nothing is going to move. So I'll leave it there.
So I've had the pleasure of being in Cristina's presence several times, and it always ends on the same note, Cristina, that I'm like, oh no, what are we going to do? But seriously.
Well, I'm back, so I can
All
help.
right, Sandy. Excellent. I'm glad to have you back. But on Cristina's note about business and the voice of business not being heard, I think that's something I would definitely want to make sure that people have heard, and hopefully we can return to that as we think about the ecosystem in which we are trying to create a fairer, more dynamic digital economy. And now, without further ado, Sandy, bring us back to digital infrastructure, taking into account that not all digital infrastructure investments might be productive, to Cristina's point. What are your thoughts, and what are some of your key points you'd like to make about that?
Well, if you want to talk about industry, let me tell you a little story. So I'm out here in Silicon Valley. The big hot thing now is agentic systems. So not those big frontier models, but little ones that do specific, and there's no best practice for doing that, the network. So what people in industry are doing out here on the West Coast is everybody is building these agentic systems because the little AIs are a lot cheaper than the big AIs, and they want to automate every little process. One of the things they have to do is there have to be agents for sell to people, to help people do things and so forth. But standards, there's no legal defense if somebody accuses you of cheating or biasing, and of course, you know that will happen. So we said at Stanford with Consumer Reports that we would build agents to represent individuals that could then talk to the companies. Now, you may think that this is, okay, that's a cute thing to do. It's digital public infrastructure. But we put out a little note that we were going to begin to do this. And we had C-level, the senior most people in every AI company show up on 1 week notice we had all the payers, we had all of the systems. They are hungry for having some sort of standards, not regulations, just standards in what it means to have an individual an AI owned by an individual to help them be able to shop, return things, avoid scams, and so forth. And so what they're doing is they're helping, along with Project Liberty, of course, to build prototype standards and test them on consumer reports subscribers who are anxious to do this sort of thing. So this is really interesting because this is what industry wants. Industry wants standards about these personally owned AIs that help you shop and return things and avoid scams. And so this is a hot thing where we can build this, we can test it, we can develop the standards, and industry will develop it. Why? Because it allows them to avoid liability, brand risk, and other things. So you may think, well, gee, is this really, how fast will this move? What will it do? I'll just point out that often these technical standards happen very, very quickly. So obviously the web development, the development of browsers took only a couple of years. The development of cookies, so you could do advertising, spread like wildfire. And I think the evidence is, and this is affirmed by these big AI and payer and other sorts of companies, is that these little agents to help you shop, return things, avoid scams and stuff are going to spread like wildfire. And we have an opportunity to create the standards for what that will look like. And so one of the people we have as part of this is Stanford Law School. It's very sort of knowledgeable in this sort of AI area, of course. And so we're beginning to build fiduciary agents. So these are agents that legally represent you in your dealings and protect you. One of the most interesting things here is not just this idea of protecting people and helping people, but it changes the data economy on its head. The agents only have to share the very minimum data that they need to get what they want. And they don't have to let you fingerprint the machine or do other sorts of things that result in a lot of data linkage. So what it means is the data really stays on your phone or your computer, except for very limited things. And those can be done actually in a way where some control over the data remains with you, even when you begin sharing some data. So there's the opportunity for the sort of personal data infrastructure, personal agent infrastructure, to form data co-ops, for consumers to band together automatically to be able to have greater bargaining power with the companies. I hope I sort of explained this in a way that is in the terms that are understandable to people, but I have never in my life seen anything where there was so much industry interest in having a standard that was a defensible standard for protecting and helping consumers. They said, why does industry want this? Because they think this is the next generation of the internet. All those web pages, all those sort of infrastructure that they have built over the last several years, they see that eventually moving away, becoming much less important. And these sort of direct contractual relationships of agents to agents being the primary way that commerce happens on the internet, much the way it is already on B2B types of things. So we're very excited about it. We're beginning to build things. We hope by the end of the year to begin testing them with the cooperation of real people. And I think there's a real chance to turn the data economy on its head. So let me just stop there.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks for being so flexible about how you are showing up. We heard you loud and clear. And so great follow-up to Christina's point about the voice of business being heard. I wonder if the new metric should be you announce an idea and a week later all the CEOs show up and that's a reason you go forward. And maybe we all have to strive for that. Cristina says yes, that's what we're going to do. As we think about this ecosystem, we do want to keep in mind that we're sitting at a Center for International Governance Innovation. So before we get to discussion, what about governments and their role, and especially cooperation among governments? Christian, your comments?
Yes, sure. I come back to that one. Let me start with a little history of myself. I have been responsible state secretary of the last Merkel government on digital and consumer protection, and I remember being invited to a very, to the digital council of the chancellor at that time, and there was also business involved. And I think it started with a 10-15 minute speech from business representatives. They had the opener, and it was a very tight situation, as they were all around complaining. Too quick regulation, wait and see, don't kill our business ideas in the cradle, give us time, and if anything ugly turns up a little bit later, we will for sure help and control that. And it went out 15 minutes from several representatives. I do not mention any name. When finally the minister of the chancellery stopped it and said, please stop it for a moment. Couldn't we also see this the other way around, that we also have a kind of a holistic approach looking into the real big positive side of digital technologies and AI, but also we should probably in the same time also talk about the risks and the downside. So again, it does not really came to a conclusion, but I would like to mention that, as this is all the issue. Yeah. So do we start first from a consumer perspective, also take into account, say, the risks, or maybe the user? It's not just a consumer, it's also a user. Or would we do it in a kind of a holistic way from the very beginning? Or would we say, please, let's do it. It's our industry here. We talk about Germany, we talk about Europe, and we are so reserved and want to make a big discussion, then the Chinese just have done it. And this is the ultimate thing where it oscillates between these two poles. So this is what I would really like to say. And I would also like to say, when we then negotiated, and I especially was responsible for the Digital Services Act and also for the Digital Governance Act, a little bit for AI and DMA, and I think I would allude also what Miapetra has just said, that we really have these issues. It's not about the digital technology, but the digital technology done and developed may also lead to a kind of, feeding the natural monopolies. And this is also something, I think, which at least for an economist like me is also a very important issue, and it was also a very important issue in discussing it in the European Union, the Parliament, and also within, let's say, that time German government. So I would be a little bit more cautious and try to balance this in a way. Of course, it would also be more than stupid just to not listen also to the voice of the businesses, who have also great technological ideas, and of course they have the centers of development. And therefore I'm very happy also about Sandy's intervention here. I see this also, I think that's a very good approach. If industry comes up asking for solutions, for standards, so how can we really involve the consumers, give them a way of the agency? And this is where I would like to stop with my intervention. I think seeing this both groups, I think for me clearly there is a business case, yes, and there is also a business case on global competition. But I think where we care about here, and this is also, I see the core project, we care about the people. And therefore I think agency for the people for me at least, comes first. And then, of course, everything else can fall in line. And this is why I really like also what we here discuss with Project Liberty. I think because this tries to make a real match, bringing these two poles together. And this, I think, could be the way forward.
Thank you, Christian. I think in some ways what I'm hearing, and we've been in several conversations in recent days, that perhaps governance really is a helpful term here in the sense that it doesn't limit us to thinking about regulation. We've now heard with Sandy's example that there are certainly moments when standards are seen by the business community as advantageous, but governance is also take into consideration citizens. So a major opportunity perhaps in that space. We are shifting now to discussion and welcome again questions from the audience here in person, but also online. To kick us off, I want to give a couple minutes to my colleague, Paul Fehlinger, who really is a driving force behind the Fair Data Economy Task Force that we've been talking about, and also this line of work at Project Liberty Institute. He's the Director of Policy, Innovation, and Impact at Project Liberty Institute. Paul, you're online. I'm going to turn it over to you and help us get started on discussion of what we've heard today.
Thank you very much. I wish I could be with you in Canada today. What I hear from the session, and I think this was also the spirit of the work of the Fair Data Economy Task Force, is that this is a lot about opportunities. This is about, at the core essence, listening to what all of you just said, this is about how a new generation of digital infrastructure solutions can enable a more distributed data economy, and how this, combined with the right moves across entrepreneurship, capital market, and how they allocate investment and policy innovation, can really unlock and unleash not only a new wave of innovation, but actually, and this is what we're here to talk about today, and this is what Paul, the other Paul, said in the very beginning in his opening remarks, can solve really thorny challenges that are on the mind and at the top of the agenda of all G7 nations at the moment. This is about how we can build more dynamic data markets, how we can tackle thorny competition issues, address agency, address how data is used, who controls the data, who owns the data, how profits are distributed in the value chain to individuals, to businesses, and to investors alike. And we have not really talked about this, but this is a reality of the top level agenda that the G7 is having this year. This is very much also about topics that touch digital sovereignty, self-determination in the digital age. And so maybe to kick us off and just drill a bit deeper with regards to the points that you just made, and open also the floor for questions and discussion with people on site and people joining remotely. I'm curious to understand from you exactly in this ecosystem approach, and it's important that it's a 360-degree ecosystem approach across entrepreneurship, capital markets, infrastructure, and policy. But what exactly is the role of policymakers in building this enabling ecosystem? And then, because the T7 is supposed to advise the G7 and help set the agenda, what can the G7 do together? What consensus do you believe can be found in the G7 under the Canadian presidency in 2025? And to make it even more concrete, what recommendations do you have to the Sherpas? And I hope that some of the Sherpas will listen to this discussion today and join, who have to negotiate those digital issues in the coming weeks, in the coming months. What recommendations do you have for them? What should they include? How can they stimulate this kind of direction, and how does it fit with the interests of the respective G7 nations at the moment? Who would like to go first?
I'm going to pick on people. So I'm going to pick on Paul for that one, Samson. And I want to emphasize what Paul Fehlinger said about today in 2025, reality, what can be on the agenda, what needs to be on the agenda for the G7. I'd be really curious, Paul, what you think.
Yeah, so I think, a common theme throughout the comments of everyone, really, without using the word, has been this is a transformation we're talking about here, right? It's something akin to, when the oil production and gasoline started fueling vehicles around the world. There was a massive infrastructure required to do that, right? There were gas stations, there were speed limits, there were everything you can imagine, and data is that many times over, right? So the transformation we're talking about here is so fundamental. What can G7 countries do about it? I think that there are two angles to it that I think are important. One is there's a dominance of AI in the G7 conversations, not surprisingly, just given where public opinion is and attention. But underpinning the conversation on AI is the data economy, right? So it's the same thing in a way, right? And so to get to the AI economy, you need to get through the data economy. And so I think that message is being passed on. So what would they do specifically? I think the point that Sandy made around standards is really important, that standards are very technical and very narrow and very powerful. But in some ways, they're easier to agree on when you empower the groups that set them, because there's a technical understanding and there's some kind of common ground is easier to define. Often standards underpin regulations, can have high-level regulations, but it's the standards kind of where the rubber hits the road. So to some degree, the ability to fast-track a conversation around standards relating to the data economy as it relates to AI, I think is something that would resonate well with G7 work. And the way that the Canadian year is going to play out is that the leaders are meeting in mid-June, and then ministerials will follow because of the timing of the election in Canada that's happening right now on April 28th, Election Day. There will be a leaders meeting, and then there will be a series of ministerials in the fall. The new government will decide that, but that's a likely possibility, which means there's scope for work to happen throughout this year, and it's not all just feeding up to leaders. So I think there's a unique opportunity potentially there to drill into some of these things. So standards. The other one that I would put on the list that underpins everything is privacy, and we all touched on it in one way or another. Cristina is right in her criticisms to say we haven't got it right at any level, whether it's the EU GDPR or others. But what do we do in that space? Now, the US doesn't really have privacy legislation, right? And so that is is it coming? There are many bills. I'm not sure what's on the plate right now, but I think the US has got to do something there, right? And in the absence of that, I think other countries are going to have to band together a little more forcefully. And that's a difficult thing within the G7, but it may become a necessary step, because privacy is just so fundamental to get this right, and that relates to the democratic, weakening of systems as a result of the current system, right? So privacy needs to be built through in a way that protects data sovereignty, as was just mentioned by Paul. So a final thought from me is on, and I think several people touched on it, Cristina, really everyone, Sandy, Miapetra as well, about the role of small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, if the solution in Finland that's going on right now about the AI factory is not enough of a solution, it's a necessary, if not sufficient, part of the answer, right? You need to find a way to involve SMEs in the equation. So this isn't something that is completely dominated by just big companies. And maybe there have been some breakthroughs that will enable that in the data economy. I'm optimistic, but we do need the kind of initiatives I think that the EU's taking, but we need a lot more for SMEs as well.
So thank you, Paul. 3 key concepts, again, to keep in mind as we continue the discussion: standards, privacy, I would say privacy rights, I'm assuming, and then the role and how we stimulate an economy that is inclusive of SMEs. Miapetra, you wanted to add some comments.
Yeah, because I was thinking that when we were working on this document on the fall, when EU started to work for the data governance and rules, and what has changed for today, I can do the checklist, the ideas, and add today sovereignty, safety, and security. And it doesn't change much what we were thinking before, only that now we see that why there should be some data sovereignty. It's open sovereignty, as we always want to have it, because then you have cross-border possibilities. So for me also, this listening to the business is always the way forward, because you don't solve the climate change, you don't solve the global democracy with the public action only. But then, Cristina, I don't see the business requiring the rights of the individuals very easily. And that is something that we add on, and then we listen businesses to make it reality, which also takes these other parts. And I really sincerely see that research being one driver for businesses. And then if we do not have democratic research possibilities, like universities having the resources, also to use supercomputing, I see the most interesting innovations coming very close to universities. And then that's at least the economists I know best is the case, that they are very closely research done in the universities, basic research, and then they come in flowers. And then one point more for the data. When we talk about data, we cannot avoid talking on AI as well. There are other languages than English. And then that's why also we need a special computing power, special data sets for large language models that are not the one and only, because then we would lose a lot of humanity on the world if we lose all that information that is stored, you say, the data in other languages. And my final remark is that I don't know what business asked for DR application in Ukraine that is helping them a lot. That is a sovereign technological solution that they do have. Their identity, their passports, their diplomas, fully digital. And I'm a little bit jealous of the India. I don't know what business asked to have the payment system that they now have. It's a sovereign. So I think Europe did too little in the past 10 years to have more sovereignty. And it's something that combination of the other policy parts all together. So that's why I see that I very much welcome that we do things globally, because not everything can be replicated everywhere. But then also something a selfishness that there are other players than a couple of big business to do this all.
Thanks, Miapetra. I wonder if I could ask Cristina to comment. You should feel free to comment as you wish, but I'm very curious if you have a thought, a response to the idea that standards is an opportunity for the G7 or governments in general. If you have a thought on what that might look like. We have Sandy's positive example, but I'm very curious if you think there's an opportunity for governments to be active on the standards front. But please take it in the direction you want.
Yeah, I will answer that, but let me start by addressing one point I think that Christian, or some of the flavor of the discussion raised. Christian, you referred to conversations in which business led, and of course they whinged and moaned that they didn't want regulation. Of course, we all know that business lobbies. Of course, we know that that is their prerogative and that's what they will insist on. That said, what I was discussing, and I think remains a significant problem, is the disconnect between the way in which the institutions develop policy and develop initiatives and the way that is useful for what's happening on the ground. Because what has changed dramatically in the last few months has been really and I don't need to certainly say this, but the geopolitical environment has created a sense of urgency in the direction of more strategic autonomy in key strategic sector. You know extremely well the situation in Germany, of course. So we're talking about defense, we're talking about infrastructure, we are talking about digital infrastructure as dual use with defense. So these things are now top of the priority for business too, because we realize in Europe we've been absolutely thrown overboard by the United States, and we've got to do our own thing. It is part a function of the fact that we really didn't. It was it's on us that we didn't kind of move in this direction earlier. But now there is a huge upswell of interest and activity on the part of business. I don't see the dichotomy quite as starkly that, here's business, they sort of do profit things and they're bad, and here's the consumer and business doesn't care about consumer. That is not necessarily true. And by the way, I'm not a lobbyist, I don't work for anyone, and I'm not lobbying for anybody. I think that many of the businesses I talk to in Europe are concerned today in creating a growth path for Europe, because this is our priority. We are in a situation where our social and economic contract is not sustainable, but to create a growth path, which is also embracing fundamental values and principles. The creation of standards is certainly very important in all of that. Business is creating their own standards. They're not waiting for governments, because already they realize that institutions and government are sort of behind. And again, Miapetra, you talk about the importance of research. I mean, this is the bias we've had in Europe for decades. We care about academic research and we fund academic research, nothing beyond that. How do you go from a product which is a prototype in a lab to something which is scalable? You take a flight to the United States and you find somebody who will fund you. So this is the problem we have. We don't need the European Commission to keep showering money onto institutions for research. This is our problem. We have spent far too much on research and not on making products that make money and people want to adopt. Adoption is the metric. So the standards are being developed. There are 2-3 cloud companies that got together and created a new standard on which everybody can agree in Europe, on which everybody can jump. And this is because there is no other environment in which this happens. But there is a great change in the sense of urgency, in the sense in which we need to favor initiatives that are commercially viable and not just continue to sort of helicopter money on little research institutions and get them to produce a prototype that doesn't go anywhere. So this is this sort of the position we're in right now.
Thank you, Cristina. I would like to connect something you said with something Miapetra said when you were citing Miapetra, the case of Ukraine, the classic, phrase that, necessity is the mother of invention. So, and I don't mean to make light of that because Ukraine's situation is and has been dire, but there is a crisis that creates that opportunity, and there is no question you need to change how you function as a government, and in large part in Ukraine. And the fact that it was both and has been both private and public working together to do that, I think is a very important point. But maybe, Cristina, in a way I hear you saying maybe there's a crisis right now in the way we think about cooperation and where sovereignty resides when it comes to the future of digital economy, both at the national level and maybe below that as well, let alone the question of how the G7 interacts going forward. But the circumstance, without demonizing any player in the G7, the playing field has changed. And so we need to adapt, is what I hear you saying. And the emphasis is on how. It's not the standards themselves, but how the standards are created here. Cristina is talking about. So I don't know, is Sandy still with us, or are you there, Sandy?
Yep, I'm still here.
So Cristina's point, business is not the enemy. Let's not play that into that kind of stereotype. You've been with a career in MIT, working at Stanford as well. You've consulted all kinds of players and actors in the digital space. What are your thoughts on how business and let's call it the public sector, can collaborate productively?
So I think there's probably two main strands. One strand is what we're following right now, which is there are not-for-profit public advocacy organizations that actually serve the public. So for instance, Consumer Reports produces testing of things that people buy and various sort of policies and so forth. So they actually build stuff and they get that customer signal, whether it's good or not, but they're not a for-profit. They're focused on the consumer. In the United States, you have AARP, which is an association of elder people who want to, in some sense, have more information, more facilities. Again, they provide something to a population and you get that customer signal. So that's an area where you can develop standards without so much of the bias that you get from for-profit things. When I talk to boards of directors, and I talk to lots of boards of directors, one of the main things that they're worried about is risk and liability. So as they deploy these new agentic systems, as they put in new sort of data systems, they're always worried about what is the liability, what is the risk. That's actually almost the first thing on their agenda, perhaps after are we profitable? Because risk is, are you going to continue to be profitable? And so whenever you get a topic that is in that risk category, and agentic systems are a good example of that, then that's a moment of learning for corporations. They want to have a standard that they can follow, hopefully not an onerous standard, just to protect their profits. That's why they ask for it. And so here we have a situation where everybody knows they have to do this for efficiency, for capability. They have to have these efficient agentic systems. But at the same time, they want to minimize the risk that they have. Well, we can help them do that by building things and testing them in the field. And I think that testing in the field, having sandboxes, having safe harbors where you can really try things out as you develop standards, is typical of, for instance, the way the internet is developed, is typical of many other sort of real computer sciencey, nerdy things. And we need to do that for these new sort of database systems that we have as well. So I think the G7 can get behind it, if only because you have to have interoperability between countries for things like selling services, selling goods, et cetera, which means the standards have to be roughly the same in the different countries. So that's something that's very much a G7 sort of a topic, I think.
Thanks, Sandy. Interoperability comes up a lot, and it's a powerful concept, a great ambition, and requires probably a lot of work as we think about the road ahead of us. But thank you for highlighting that. I want to return to my colleague, Paul Fehlinger, who's online. Paul, as you listen in, what are your thoughts, and also any other provocations to our panelists about what we need to be grappling with?
I want to continue to sort of, I have a fun question for all of you on stage and also for Cristina and Sandy joining us remotely. Put yourselves in the shoes again, and I insist on this, in the role of the Sherpas this year. What is the one headline for the chapter in the G7 communiqué on this nexus of a fair data economy and the possibilities around next generation digital infrastructure that we're discussing here? What's the one headline for this chapter that you would see?
So I'm going to turn to Paul Samson, who has probably the most direct line to editorial control here. So what is that headline, Paul?
Well, we're in the middle of an election, so there is no editorial control of any kind at the moment, and so recognize that. But I think that the new government that comes in will be seized with this issue. I think that everyone has said it, but the geopolitics have changed, every country has been woken up to a new regime, right? There's no, to me, it's like that child's fable about Humpty Dumpty, which is an eggshell creature sitting on a wall, and it falls off. And when you put it back up on the wall, it cannot be exactly as it was before, right? So that has happened in every country, in Canada probably more than almost anywhere. So I think, everyone is very seized with this issue. I think the headline, Paul, to answer your question, might be something along the lines of, ensuring the kind of words that we've just discussed in order to make interoperability both secure, right, from a kind of security perspective, as well as better from a market opportunity situation. These aren't the exact words, of course. We need interoperability. In order to do that, we could encourage work on standards. And I want to come back to that because I agree that businesses are already doing it. Businesses have to do it. But what is required is more consensus around standards that factor in civil society perspectives and government perspectives so that those standards can be more universalized, right? And so I think there could be a line that the G7 would encourage work on standards in order to build further interoperability and other things supporting the data economy, including the development of the AI economy. And final tiny thing would be we have an initiative in this direction that is working with something called the Partnership for Information and Democracy, which includes 50 democracies, all of the G7 countries, probably all of the OECD countries, and a number of other ones. And we're trying to use that as a forum of a discussion around the importance of these things at the political level, to have a standards kind of working group that could help get political buy-in for that work. So I would see a link to that.
Okay, then I'm going to just play with that and say that the headline for the G7, according to Paul, is setting a new standard for the global digital economy. All right, Miapetra. Yeah.
My title could be something that the G7 opens data economy for a million more actors. That I would like to see, that seizing this opportunity, as businesses are now really diversing the companies that they are working with. And I see that the G7 level that could really take these steps, like the recommendation we have, they are multiple, but this is like the target where I go to, so data economy for many more. If there would be another title that could have been like something taking steps for secure digital infrastructure for everyone. I don't like the word digital infrastructure because I come from the country of Nokia. You think that I'm advertising, but we understand the concept of infrastructure. It's not only your cellular phone system. It's the programs, it's your own governance, like with the data ownership, the models that we look forward happening one day. So let's see if G7 will have something to prepare for the next one to be ready.
So digital economy for everyone as a kind of a key concept there. Christian?
Yeah, okay. I would also like to come back on that, of course. I think, yes, of course, really security is an issue. Interoperability should be an issue. And of course, really common standards. And for me, following my earlier interventions, I would also really see agency, especially also for the users, and really say a balance of power between, say, consumer and civil society organizations, and of course industry. So, which interests, of course, we also have to take seriously, especially also in global competition, as not every other country in the world would do, say, an industry policy which would be in line with our standards here. Let me put it like this. I think, yeah, this is really what I think is very important. Last but not least, if we think about the industry point, I'm working here now for a global organization looking at the whole G20 community. And let me also say, of course, that what, say, Africa, for instance, expects also from G7 and G20 as such, or G30 as they now call it, would really be that they have their own right for building up their industrial system. So the worst thing which could happen is that just big industry of, say, this part of the world would take over the African industrialization. This would be a very bad move. How to do it is another issue, but I would like to mention it.
Thanks, Christian. I mean, you mentioned balance of power. I mean, in a way that I'm hearing a headline along the lines of balancing or rebalancing the power for a better, more secure digital economy. I'm just going to intervene and say, to me, I'd like to make balance a verb. It's a continual action. I think it's a creative tension. I think we're hearing from our panelists, if we believe in agile governance as an aspiration, at least, setting a rigid balance of before we even get to the new emerging technology might not be the best way to go. Cristina, your thoughts on the headline for the G7?
My main thought is that I don't like words like we should encourage. It just suggests an elongated timeline. We should encourage them to have a working group, to again meet in 6 months and again encourage them in this direction. What are we talking about? We are in an emergency. We need to act right now. Europe is 90% a colony when it comes to infrastructure. So, and that means we don't have the kill switch. The International Court, Criminal Court in The Hague operates on all its files and all its data are on a Microsoft server, and they've been deemed an outlaw agency by Mr. Trump. So it's a matter of days before Microsoft turns around and says, sorry, we have to terminate the contract with you. And the European cloud industry has been dying for the last 3-4 years, and we don't have really, or do we, alternatives that are feasible. So there is a scramble right now in Europe. And so I feel anguished by the sentiment that we need to encourage more people to have a chat in another meeting, swan around for another year and a half, and distill some principle that maybe with the wind behind in 5 years we'll get somewhere, and they won't. So to me, this is the real anguish of our time. It is over. We need to stop talking and doing. And business is the only one who can do. Yes, civil society, yes, the think tanks, yes, all of that, nice mood music. We need to do right now. This is my position at this point.
I'm not sure I can get a headline out of that, Cristina, other than we're in crisis.
Get on with it.
Get on with it.
Stop talking. Do.
And we don't have a kill switch. That is a phrase that will stick with me. Sandy, your thoughts on what the G7 might have as a headline in terms of its accomplishments or progress on the digital economy?
Let me suggest something and then explain it. So I think the idea of digital standards for citizen security. Privacy is an example of a type of security. It's personal security. But we also need to be able to talk about, cyber attacks, of course, but also security has something to do with representation of people, the people's voice, preservation of that. So security for citizens, for instance, means something about the security of democracy. It means also something about how governments can actually interoperate in a secure method. So digital standards for security. Most of the world still doesn't have digital identity. We don't have a number of things in our various systems that are really secure practices in finance, in shipping, in health. And I think we need to, that's really, in some sense, the problem is that we have all these things that sort of work and sort of don't work. They could work a lot better if we had the right sort of digital infrastructure, and it would save innumerable lives and also lead to a lot better prosperity.
So digital standards for security. and then I can see, as you're talking about and just explaining what you mean by security, Sandy, is a very broad understanding. Gets back to your point about the motivation, at least among some in the business sector, that liability is a great motivation for them to seek standards that reduce risk. I think we all, especially in this age of AI, wonder about the risk of new technologies. So this idea of security, there are many of the comments have already tapped into some of the questions I've seen online. One building on this is, and get back to this question, which I think is a very G7 question. Security is the way that we need to think about security also changing, so that, where is national security and what is the opportunity for international security within the G7 or other groups? Someone online mentioned, just undersea cables, some of which are privately owned. Literally, physically, how we're connected going forward, how secure is that? I guess I'm going to go with optimism versus pessimism. And maybe ask anyone on the panel to start, but I'm thinking of you, Paul, Samson in particular, to start us down there. Optimistic about international cooperation around the security of the digital economy that we're all part of?
Yeah, I'm always optimistic, but realistic. I think that, if you take NATO, for example, right now, it's going to go through a massive transformation over the next couple of years. There are wild cards, right, that could play out. But I think regardless, one of the key issues is going to be what is the cyber security strategy for NATO countries. I'm using NATO as a proxy for a grouping of allies. Is the critical infrastructure safe, right, to cyber attack? That might become one of the most important security features. Now, in the event where countries go their own way, I think that's a real risk out there that is on the radar of every country. So there's this question of, do we have our sovereign capabilities? The cloud was just mentioned a minute ago. If you don't have the control of a lot of your sovereign capabilities, you better get control of them, right? So I think there will be a dynamic for cooperation across like-minded countries, but there'll also be this national part of it as well.
And it just makes me think about the cost implicit in what you're talking about in different scenarios. The huge cost is everyone starting to have its own autarkic approach to these things. Miapetra.
Yeah, two aspects. First, coming from the Baltic Sea, underwater gas pipelines, cables are under the threat because you have an enemy close by. But then and that is like, of course, we cannot prove 100%, but we try to make it proofer. And then the business has been created so that there is always a satellite or cable or another landline. And so this combination, what the business is invented to be secured connectivity. But then another aspect is that it's not enough to have anymore the physical and the intangible, like the cyber attacks. There is the third that we have to understand is the data and the content, because manipulated data is not secure anymore. When you don't know, when you don't understand, when you cannot trust. Because even physically, the data is coming and there is no cyber attack, or that is like the firewall in your mobile phone or your computer is thinking, what is coming, is that still correct and trusted? We can then talk about the digital literacy, that you should always be cautious, but then it's really the third element of the security, that do you have something to contact or ask? Do you have like a good guy next to you? You can debate and question the content of the data. So I just want to make us all alert on this one, because we see the amount of disinformation multiplied with the new technologies too. So the three aspects: physical, intangible, but the intangible, the content, and then the cyber security.
Thanks, Miapetra. And I think that last one, called intangible, but getting to the issue of trust, which we haven't talked a lot about, trustworthy data. I mean, trusted data and high quality data is immensely valuable as we move into a more intensely generative AI economy. Cristina, I wonder what your thoughts are on, the framing, security, innovation, as you think about what the future of Europe could be in this space. How important or relevant or useful is the framework of security?
Framework of security is all important. It's everything. It's now dominating the conversation, and rightly so. Because I can tell you that the Sputnik moment for us Europeans was the day in which Zelensky was met in the Oval Office, and all of Europe will remember that as a Sputnik moment. We were texting each other that night saying, what have we just watched? What have we just watched? Because it was such a shocking moment for us Europeans to see Europe thrown overboard. And yet, when I was speaking to American friends the same night and saying that was a shocking moment for us Europeans, it was very disturbing, the answer was, grow up. Stop being crybabies. We're not going to do your dirty laundry again. You've got the enemy on the border. If he walks across, is your problem, not ours. Sort it out. And this was not Republican, it was Democrats. So Europe is in a very, very, very different reality all of a sudden. And that is the conversation. There is no other. We cannot kind of afford to be now talking about niceties and, consumer values and all of that. It's there, but, we have an absolute impending, urgent need to do because we don't have the kill switch. That's the reality.
Thank you, Cristina. Interesting to think about security as a framing device. I don't want to impose myself on the T7, let alone the G7, but I am an American. I live in the United States. Security is a core concept or feature of how I think the current administration thinks about the world as well. No matter what their policies might be, I think that might be common ground, believe it or not. Christian, any thoughts on this about security of the digital economy?
I think it's very well said. So, of course, we are in a very, very critical moment. And, of course, I think we could smell it for a while, so it does not come as a super duper surprise. But in the force and in the deepness of that one, I was also at least a little bit surprised. And of course, it is true that we have to consolidate our status. We have, of course, consolidate our like-minded groups, and we have to strengthen them, and we should use all forces to do that. And the only sidekick I would like to make again is, let's also do it for the rest of the global community, who is also will be affected by that shock. And therefore, I think it would be a super duper good idea for the European Union, but also for other like-minded bodies, whether it's in Canada or even in the US and other states, that we really are supportive to those who will lose the most if it comes to a big conflict. And this is the global South, Africa, Latin America, and Asia as a region. Yeah, not talking about China here. But this is what we should not forget. We cannot rescue just us.
So I'm mindful of time as a moderator. Want to say that if I were to quickly, get to the heart of what I'm hearing today, the moment is, we've often said critical, the word urgent comes up, but I think today we've heard crisis. And I think just a wake-up call that there really is a need, not just an opportunity for forums and organizations such as the G7, the G20, and others to grapple with the new reality. And this is entwined with the future of the digital economy and what it means for individual citizens and just how we are structuring the economic balance of power and political power as well. There are so many more things that we could talk about, but I want to be, again, respectful of time and say thank you to Sandy Pentland, who was online and lost his video feed. Thank you, Cristina Caffarra, for joining us remotely. Paul Fehlinger, my colleague, who again, driving force behind this whole Fair Data Economy Task Force. Paul, so glad you could join us remotely today. Christian Kastrop, thank you so much. Miapetra, thank you. And Paul Samson, thank you. And thank you to CIGI for hosting us today. This has been an amazing opportunity, and I think a very lively and direct conversation, which was much appreciated on an important topic. So thank you, everyone, for attending online and in person as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.